My next guest is often cited by the authors I speak to on the corner table. His new book, Head, Hand, Heart, calls for a better appreciation of human talent in a time when the word talent is more often used to describe the city trader than the nurse on the night shift, and where the good life is reserved for a self-perpetuating class of aspirational cognitive or head workers whose often vague relationship to society's gains contrast with those of the hand and heart professions we now like to call essential. David Goodhart is sitting with me here. David, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
So tell us, why have you chosen Piccola in Hampstead?
What I really like about it is that it serves my favourite dish in the world, which is pasta fagioli.
Which is a sort of a bean soup.
Like a kind of bean soup, yeah. It's really almost a meal in itself. So if you have pasta fagioli as a starter, you have to have something quite light as a main course.
Will it be the fagioli?
Oh, definitely,
today?
yeah. Have you got pasta fagioli? Yeah.
And I'll take the pan-fried sardines.
Could I have a tonic water as well with ice and lemon?
Let me start just by recounting the last time I was out with friends before the UK went into lockdown. It was a Sunday afternoon, late February. 5 of us sat round a table at the pub, all knowing that the pandemic was going to hit, all knowing that in the morning we'd be off to our regular jobs, handling WordPress engines and spreadsheets. And so staring into our pints and then at each other and asking, what on earth is the point of people like us at a time like this? Were we coming, do you think, to a realisation of what you refer to in the book as peak head?
Well, yeah, I mean, don't be too self-denigrating. Cognitive jobs are of value. I mean, particularly the kind of higher end. Our species needs high intelligence, arguably more now than ever. But I mean, the basic point the point of the book is in the title, Head, Hand, Heart, and my argument is that we've allocated too much reward and prestige to one cluster of human aptitudes, and therefore inevitably, there's a degree of zero sum about this. We've inevitably drawn prestige and reward away from the other clusters of aptitudes, and I think we've got out of kilter, and we need to rebalance, and I think it's kind of happening anyway. I mean, as you use the phrase that I use in the book, peak head. I mean, I think there is a growing realisation that we have overexpanded higher education, which means that too many people, particularly in the kind of middle and lower cognitive ability levels, people who would have, a generation or two ago, who would have been doing HNDs, HNCs, higher technical manual qualifications of one kind or another, are probably now going to university, and they aren't necessarily benefiting from it. Some of them are, but many of them won't be, at least in strict economic terms, because the graduate income premium has fallen, as you'd expect when so many more people do go to university. And also, a third of graduates are not even in graduate jobs for 5-10 years after graduating, and that's with a very elastic definition of what a graduate job is. So this is both economically and politically, culturally dysfunctional, because we have massive skill shortages in skilled trades, in middling technical functions. Indeed, one of the reasons why the testing system may not be working particularly well in Britain at the moment is because we lack the kind of white-coated lab technician people. We've got plenty of academic scientists, and we need them too, but we're missing the white-coated lab technicians. And of course we have these huge recruitment crises in the caring functions, in nursing, care homes. We're going to need 150,000 dementia nurses, specialist dementia nurses, in a few years' time. And so we're going to have to shift the kind of cultural and the financial signals for this to happen.
And so you posed that question quite early on in the book. I'm quoting from it here. Can we really argue that the work of a junior account manager at a city PR firm is more useful than that of a bus driver or an adult care worker? It's important to recognise that this book isn't opposed to meritocracy per se, because meritocracy is the theme that runs throughout it, but rather argues for a more complex form of meritocracy that recognises human ability across multiple spectra.
Yeah. So when meritocracy, it's kind of the worst system apart from all the others. But I want to see it more as let's think about meritocracy as a pragmatic kind of labour market principle. It's about getting the right people into the right job. So if you're in favour of meritocratic selection for jobs, but you're against a meritocratic society, this is quite a fine distinction. I think there is a real distinction there. It's a bit like the distinction between Lionel Jospin talked about being in favour of a market economy but not a market society. And I think you can apply the same thing to meritocracy in a way. It's it's not it's never going to be. I don't think it should be an ideal. Partly because of the hubris that it creates amongst the successful, and the fact that because it's based on merit, the unsuccessful have only themselves to blame, which is not a comfortable psychological place to be in. So, like all principles, it needs to be balanced by other principles. Like in this case, I guess the principle of the moral, political, legal equality of all people. So we want to balance the idea of rewarding those with relevant merit with a broader, almost sort of social Christian notion of everybody being of value, and therefore, we need to have high minimum wages, and we need to respect people doing basic jobs.
Here I'd like to quote from Matthew Crawford's The Case for Working with Your Hands, where he says, "The satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world through manual competence have been known to make a man quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. The building stands, the car now runs, the lights are on." So let's get on to handwork here. Why, when the achievements of manual work are so tangible, do we as a society not recognise them?
Yeah, I think it's a deep historical roots, probably going back to classical civilization, reinforced maybe by Christianity, the idea of the Platonic purity of thought and the corruption and sinfulness of the embodied. And, for many of the last few hundred years, society hasn't been able to afford a very large cognitive class. It tends to have been a class drawn mainly from the already privileged. And then you look at institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, almost all our prime ministers and, big slice of our cabinet ministers over the last 150 years or so have been through these institutions, similarly with the Ivy League universities in America or the Grande École in France. You have a kind of, all sorts of inbuilt biases, I think, towards the cognitive analytical. I think other countries, particularly Germanic countries, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and Scandinavian countries often do continue to have greater respect for practical intelligence, manual, technical, skilled trades work. And that is partly because in the case of Germany, I know Germany reasonably well. I worked there as a journalist for 3 years. So, it'd be perfectly imaginable that my children or your children would do an apprenticeship in Germany. It's kind of classless. You get a lot of middle-class kids doing apprenticeships. 50% of school leavers still do an apprenticeship in Germany. Which kind of, if you can't think of what to do, if you're a kind of 18-year-old German, you might well do an apprenticeship. Whereas here, you sort of think, if you can't think, what do you go to university? And, and 2.5, 3 years later, you'd have been paid, not terribly well, but you'd have been paid through that period, and you'd have acquired a skill that is a kind of bread ticket for life. Quite a few people, I think, I was looking at this the other day, in Angela Merkel's cabinet, quite a few of them have apprenticeships. They also have university degrees. Someone like Jens Spahn did a Bankkaufmann, banking salesman apprenticeship, and then I think he worked in a bank for a while, and then some years later decided to go to university. I think he's got a PhD in something as well. But there's a sort of sense that they're all sort of at some level on the same level. Obviously not completely, but I think the whole concept of parity of esteem is a bit of a red herring. There's never going to be complete parity of esteem. If you're a genius, if you're Einstein, you should be in a bloody university, telling us how the motions of the planets work.
You refer also to what you call the missing middle, which you suggest could, if filled, solve the bigger problems that we face here. What does this phrase mean, first of all?
I suppose technically what it means is people who used to do, in their hundreds of thousands, used to do so-called level 4, level 5 qualifications. In the jargon of international education, level 3 is A-levels or its equivalent, and level 6 is is a bachelor's degree at a university. So 4 and 5 are the kind of skills, higher technical skills that polytechnics used to teach. And many of those skills are still taught at the former polytechnics, now universities. They're often done, I think, in a kind of over-academicized way. If you're doing a construction management degree, you have lots of sort of general economics, business studies, possibly a bit of accountancy kind of thrown in, which may or may not be useful. You probably spend rather less time than your equivalent 30 years ago would have done actually on a construction site. So whether the person emerging from university with a construction management degree is more useful to a big construction company today than his or her equivalent 30 or 40 years ago, I assume probably not, or not so much more useful that it justifies 3 or 4 years full-time study, probably at a residential university, with lots of kind of bells and whistles attached to make it academic, to kind of justify its existence in a university. Yeah, so in educational terms, the missing middle is those courses that people used to do when they were training to do skilled trades, when they were training to be an electrician or a plumber. You know, it required a kind of cognitive aspect to it. You know, you need to know some of the theory of electricity if you're an electrician, otherwise you blow everyone up. But that used to be done in these at FE colleges or polytechnics, in these intermediate institutions. Often with much greater flexibility, so you could work while doing the courses. You know, you didn't have to be a full-time student, and I mean, this is what we should go back to. Not for everybody. I mean, those people who have a real passion for, or just a great ability at the more kind of abstract academic intelligence, should continue down that track. But I think if you look at the kind of range of human abilities, there are only a limited number of people who have that sort of high academic analytical intelligence, and many of the rest of us should be doing other things.
I think I'll go for the linguine alla calo, please.
Oh, I do like a bit of liver, actually. It's one of those sort of things that you never cook for yourself at home any longer. I'll have the liver, actually. Yeah.
So on your reflections of your own education, some of which appears in the book, what do you think was the biggest influence in terms of how you approached this subject?
Yeah, I do weave a bit of autobiography through the book. I had a vague recollection of doing an IQ test when I was sort of 10 or 12. I mean, and I kind of think I was around. I mean, I think I may have been a smidgen above average, nothing to write home about particularly. But I kind of reflected on my own, in a sense, the kind of the context dependency and to some extent arbitrariness, of sort of intelligence, of cleverness. You need encouragement. You need a kind of audience. You need a sympathetic audience. Many of us don't have one. I remember when I was a teenager, I didn't think of myself as particularly bright. I went to a very famous school, the same one as our Prime Minister, and I failed my A-levels. I got a D and an E and an F in my A-levels. A few years later, having retaken them, and I went to Kent University for a year and then to York. I ended up getting a first-class degree actually one of the reasons why I did well at York is that I got interested I got genuinely interested in ideas and academic things, intellectual things, which I'm sort of slightly ashamed to say was partly because I briefly got sort of hooked on student Marxism. But my dad was a Tory MP and I did go to Eton, so I think being a Trotskyist for a year or two is perhaps excusable. Yeah, and I ended up editing, an intellectual monthly magazine. Many of my friends I think of as far cleverer than me. I'm really interested in ideas, but I'm not particularly quick. I'm not very good at the sort of pattern recognition. Friends who are good at maths or engineering are far better at the practical things of life. Pretty hopeless at DIY. I like trying my hand, but shelves have been known to fall down. But it's confidence and context is so important. What I learned from reflecting on my own experience is that not exactly arbitrariness, but the context dependency. And I think there is such a thing as that there are kind of innate factors in intelligence, but there are obviously also hugely important environmental factors and chance factors. Mm-hmm. And temperamental and personality factors.
Yeah, and where you land, I suppose, historically. You mentioned that a lot of the anger among young graduates today and the turn towards extreme sort of Marxist ideas is to do with this absence of a sense in which you can drop out or see your chances fall in one area of life and find a way through in others, the way that it seems previous generations throughout the 20th century tell of in their success stories.
No, this is one of my main points of the book, in a way, that we have this single ladder up. We've created a very narrow definition of what it is to lead a successful life. we're germinating dissatisfaction everywhere. And actually, even in times when people were poorer, when there were more little ladders up rather than there being one big ladder. If you miss that big ladder for whatever reason, you don't do A-levels and go to university. Life is not necessarily a disaster, and there are lots of people who live perfectly happy lives and are not full of resentment. But when we're talking aggregates here, I think there is. I call it it's the 15-50 problem too. I mean, that when 15% of your school or town people go to college and you don't, it doesn't really matter. When 50% do, or even 40% do, and you don't, then it's a completely different psychological ballgame. And there aren't any longer the other sources of esteem, or the other sources of esteem are much weaker. That just being a good, hard-working person, the dignity of labour, being, if you're a man, being a good husband and father. I mean, obviously all of these things are still esteemed to a degree, but they often struggle to substitute for the prestigious cognitive safety zone that we're all encouraged to strive for these days. That is a real problem, and I think we want to return to a time when we had lots more little ladders up, a sense that there is no single scale of worth. There are multiple scales of worth.
A good definition of equality, really, one that we should adopt, isn't the equality to achieve the highest position, but the equality of opportunity to fail and not be ruined. What do you think it will take to entice men in particular to join the caring professions? Because doesn't the friction there lie in the fact that when a woman, say, qualifies as a mechanic, she is seen to have broken through a glass ceiling, whereas a man who trains to become a nurse is rather thought to have simply withdrawn from competition? Aren't the incentives just completely skewed and lopsided?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in this question of whether men are going to start moving into the heavily professional public care economy. I mean, nursing in this country is 88%. NHS nurses are 88% female. Primary school teachers are 85% female. People working in social care homes are 82% female, I think. I think this will change. It'll change partly through economic and cultural signals. I read some the other day that more people are applying for nursing positions, nurse training positions, partly I think as a result of the pandemic. The elevated status of people who are on the front line, the feeling people are looking for purpose and meaning in their lives, and this is obviously a purposeful and meaningful thing. And there are, one of the reasons for the recruitment crisis in these areas is partly the benign reason that women have many more choices now. Go back a generation or two, there were glass ceilings, and many professions you couldn't continue after you got married. I mean, famously in the civil service, but women had it was far harder for women to progress up the professional and career ladder. So you ended up having absolutely brilliant women running primary schools, or being ward sisters in hospitals. Their daughters are all partners in city law firms, or they're in the cabinet or whatever. The public service has got a free lunch from really, really able women. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, and that doesn't happen so much now because those women are freer to compete right across the economy with men. But what's not happened is that men haven't moved in, as it were, to make up for the shortfall of women in many of those areas. When they have moved in, it's complicated too, because they often, men, whether it's cultural or biological, who knows, but, men are often more disagreeable, more ambitious, more work-focused than women, and so end up in all the senior nursing positions. There's something called the glass escalator for men.
Right.
Which that creates its own problems too. I mean, I think it creates a degree of resentment amongst female nurses that in many hospitals they're bossed around by male sort of executive nurses.
Right.
Will it happen more? I think it will. It'll have to, partly because there won't be other jobs. So many of these jobs are the jobs that are not automatable. They're not going to be subject to AI. They can't be exported. You can't export your granny in an adult social care home. Well, you can, but it's tricky. So they're necessarily rooted here, and I think the pay and status will rise. I think the status has already risen as a result of the pandemic. I think the pay will follow. I think also, or perhaps a degree of automation. It's limited, but we're seeing this in Japan, the use of robots and so on in elderly care centres. I think we'll see more of that here, and men will follow the technology.
In the meantime, though, we need to raise the status of domesticity in general, not just in the professions, but care within the
that
home.
is one of the points I make, that if you're raising the status of care in the public economy, I think it almost follows, it's a necessary condition of that you raise it in the private realm too. And this is where I have a bit of an argument with perhaps one of the more controversial bits of the book. Implicitly, I have a bit of an argument with the priorities of a lot of the women's equality movement, or certainly the most influential parts of the women's equality movement of the last 20 or 30 years, which is focused overwhelmingly on career success for women, or as level a playing field as possible, given the fact that women have children and still often want to have children, at the most level possible playing field between men and women in professional careers, and that's all fine. Obviously, I'm not opposed to that, but in the process, it's kind of sort of masculinized the argument. It's almost a sort of caricature of a sort of a male disdain, or a certain kind of male disdain for the private realm of the family and domesticity. That's women's work. I mean, it's almost as if that is lower status women's work, but it's becoming more even. And I think the state should do a lot more. I mean, we're real laggards internationally, and single earner households get absolutely smashed in the tax system. We don't even allow couples bringing up children together to share their tax allowances, which is absolutely crazy. Most rich countries do. Which
international examples do you think would be worth imitating?
I mean, some sort of melange of all of the more generous ones. I mean, just make it easier, and you'd have lower levels of separation and single familydom. I think if you supported the family more at the time of highest stress, which is when if you've got 2 or even 3 kids, all under 6, say, it's a massively stressful period. It's often if you're in a professional career, it's often at a time of your life when work is also at its most demanding. So make it easier for one of the 2 parents to stay at home for a bit longer without having the necessity of returning to work. And you can do that, as I say, through reducing the tax burden on those families, allowing the stayer and the worker to share their tax allowances. That would mean, what's the tax allowance now? About 12 grand, is it? 12.5 grand?
I think it's about that, yes.
So put those 2 together. That's 25. You don't pay any tax until you earn 25 grand. The average income is 28 or 29. So, you'd be taxed on only a very, very small proportion of your income. I mean, we do obviously we have various forms of family support, but I think we should think harder about that, and by all means encourage men to do it. The absolutely vital and essential work of nurture, whether it's looking after young children or old people, or both at the same time.
Yes.
And I mean, all the surveys show that most women in Britain don't actually share the priorities of 50-50 on boards and so on. Their priority is much more making it easier to work part-time or not at all when children are very young. And I don't see why that should be seen as a conservative idea, but it does tend to be.
As you yourself clarify towards the end of the book, the triumvirate of head, hand and heart are not separate categories, but are very much interdependent, and that it is the head work in our society that is lacking much more in hand and heart than the hand and heart are necessarily lacking in head. Are the clever people in power, whom we need to understand this, clever enough do you think?
Well, politics is a sort of funny old game. I mean, you get quite a range, I think, of different kinds of abilities, but it tends to reward verbal fluency, relative degree of gregariousness, I suppose, a degree of kind of moral flexibility. I mean, it's sort of, in a way, in a good cause. Democracy requires that politicians sort of change their positions on things. But I mean, I think I quote Toby Young in the book as sort of saying how much better everything would be if the people in the top 15% of the bell curve for intelligence ran everything, and I think that is completely wrong. I think one of the problems is that clever people have a certain experience of the world that isn't the same as everybody else's. They find certain things easier, possibly some things more difficult. And you want to, particularly in representative institutions, political, organisational, perhaps even commercial, you actually want a range of intelligences and a range of personality types. And the current selection and promotion system tends to select and promote on relatively narrow cognitive grounds. If you look at the kind of decisions that were being taken, in the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, the creation of the post-war British society, welfare state, etc., and then you look at the decisions that have been taken, say, in the last 10 or 15 years over some pretty fundamental things, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, austerity, and all of these people would have been university educated. It doesn't suggest that the greater selection by cognitive ability and the greater focus on that as a qualification for top jobs has not produced any obvious improvement in the way that our lives and institutions are managed. One of the things about highly intelligent people is that they're very good at rationalising things to themselves because they're used to being the prize winners of our society. They often lack the kind of humility to see things as they really are.
Thanks very much for introducing the Cola to me, David, and thanks very much for coming on the corner table.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for the pasta fagioli.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening. As always, special thanks is owed to Boogie Belgique for the soundtrack.